Are the Brewers really a contender or just another good regular season team? What's the story behind the Tigers' numbers this year and their results? Are the Braves becoming the team we were afraid they were? We're going to go around the diamond and turn back the clock on this episode of The Winning Season with Seth G. I'm your host, Seth G. Let's get started right off the bat with the Brewers. So the Brewers are having a pretty incredible season overall, obviously the best record in baseball. And earlier this week, they defeated the Mariners 22-0, which was the largest shutout victory, or tied, for the largest shutout victory in the modern era of baseball. And so, the Brewers have been really an incredible franchise here over, call it, the last 5 to 7 years. And overall, they've had some really, really good results. So I started thinking about this year's Brewers team. They're obviously having another incredible preseason. And of course, I couldn't help but also think about the postseasons that they've had to go along with those regular seasons, which have really been a tale of two stories. So I want to talk today about where the Brewers are at this year and, where do we think they can go in the postseason. So let's just start with, over the last 5 years, they've got the third best record in all of baseball in the regular season. And only the Dodgers and the Astros have more wins than they do. Now, obviously, as we've discussed on previous episodes, the Dodgers spend at a kind of a nauseating clip. And let's just say there's maybe a few years in there where the Astros were slightly suspect. But nonetheless, the Brewers overall have been the third best team in baseball, which is pretty outstanding. However, what gets real interesting is that they're 5-13 in the postseason in that same time frame, and they've won one single series in those 5 years, which was last year. So they beat the Cubs last year. They play the Dodgers. They get swept pretty easily in 4 games. They get outscored 4-15. And I think some of the root of who the Brewers are and potential concerns for this year lie in that. So obviously, you score 4 runs in a 4-game series, you're not going to win, right? Period. That's not good. And so digging into that to try to figure out, well, what's the issue, right? Because they consistently are a very good regular season team. They're always in the playoffs, and then the playoffs, they seem like they're a totally different team. So a lot of it's really rooted in how the Brewers score runs. So their pitching's been real consistent. Their pitching's outstanding this year. Obviously, Mizorowski, Trevor McGill in the bullpen. Their ERA is better year over year, starting and bullpen. And what's interesting enough is that they've scored the third most runs in all of baseball and surrendered the fewest. So again, recipe for success, should there be concerns. Where the concerns really come in is how they score those runs. So most people know that, like all sports, I think, baseball is a tale of two seasons. There's the regular season and there's the playoffs, and things certainly change. So here's some interesting numbers when you think about the playoffs holistically. So over the last 5 years in the regular season, 41.2% of all runs scored can be attributed to the long ball. What's interesting is that number jumps to over 48% in the playoffs. Now, let's talk about why that may be. There's several factors. First of all, nowadays pitching is so specialized. Managers are quicker to go to the bullpen to get better matchups. And then, of course, when you get in the playoffs, the teams that are in the playoffs tend, generally speaking, their pitching is much better, right? So the idea of manufacturing runs or having the ability to manufacture runs gets a lot more challenging in the postseason than it is in the regular season, which has been the Brewers' downfall. So when you look at this season, I think you can't help but have the same concern. So currently today, the Brewers have hit 119 home runs, which is the worst in all of baseball. So they hit the long ball less than anyone else. And so when you look at this team from top to bottom, offensively, they're very balanced. Again, they score a lot of runs. They score runs in a myriad of different ways. They're a very aggressive team in how they play. They're aggressive on the base pass, which again is translating into great regular season success as we're seeing again here this year. The challenge comes in to they still do not hit home runs. And so when you start thinking about what are this team's chances in the playoffs, on the surface you would say, hey, they're as good as anybody in the National League. You could certainly argue they're the best team in the National League and they're going to win the National League. But the problem lies in is that the playoffs historically tell us if you can't hit home runs, you can't win. And the Brewers historically over the last 5 years in the playoffs have not hit home runs and they can't win. So the real question that lies in front of us is there anything different about this Brewers team this year that would give us a different thought going into the playoffs? And I think I have 2 things that I would call out about the Brewers. On the surface, they are balanced enough offensively defensively, and pitching, yes, I think on the surface they are good enough to win in the playoffs. I think they're good enough to go to the World Series, and I certainly think that they're good enough to beat anybody in the National League. However, I would say that their lack of power, just like the last 5 years has caught up to them, I have a suspicion it's going to catch up to them again this year. So the question for the Brewers as we wind down the season, as we get into the playoffs, is can they hit enough home runs to win in the playoffs? And I think I would tell you from my perspective, the answer is probably not. And as much as I'd hate to say that, I love this Brewers team. They just do so many things well. They're a really fun team to watch. But the reality is that the playoffs over the last 5 to 10 years has certainly taught us if you can't hit home runs, your odds of winning are almost zero. Now, the one thing I'll say they have going in their favor this year, their pitching is so good, they are not going to give up many runs. So it's not going to take a lot. But when I start thinking about them having the third most runs scored in the regular season, I don't think that translates to the playoffs. However, pitching, of course, always does. So their best bet is to play a lot of 2-1, 3-1, 1-0 games. I think that's their path for success. But I think when you look at them over the course of the season, and statistically speaking, any games that I would say get in the above 3-run category, their odds of winning in the playoffs are going to be dramatically reduced because they do not hit the long ball. And again, statistics clearly show that that's a real problem in the playoffs. So I think the Brewers, chances and their recipe for success in the postseason, they got to keep the score down to 3 runs or less, which is a real big challenge to do. It's a lot of pressure on the pitching staff, but I'm definitely concerned that they just don't have enough power to survive 6-4 games, 7-3 games. I just see them not winning many of those games, if any, in the playoffs. And so I think for them, their pitching's been elite all year. It's going to have to be extremely elite in the playoffs. And again, I suspect their run production was going to come down because, again, manufacturing runs in the playoffs is a real challenge to do. So interested to see how they finish out the season. There's nothing that says they won't finish the season the way they've played the whole regular season. It's probably they very well may end up with the best record in baseball. But I would definitely say let's keep an eye on their power numbers, because if that doesn't change going into the playoffs, they're going to have a lot of things fall their way, I think, to get all the way to the World Series. So be very, very interesting to watch. So let's move on to the Detroit Tigers. So a buddy of mine, give a shout out to Nathan here, brought this to my attention earlier this week. And when I first read his message, I thought, man, there's no way that's true. So I began to do some research, and it is. Not that I ever doubted him per se. But there's some really odd thing happening in Detroit this year that we rarely see in baseball. And I wanted to spend a few minutes today kind of breaking that down. So current state, the Detroit Tigers are 61-68. They're 7 games below 500. They're technically, in the run for the wild card, but again, mainly because the American League's really poor. And, if you're at 500, you're in the playoffs right now. So they're only a couple of games back, 2.5, 3 games back of the wild card. And, on the surface, that's, you think, hey, they're right there in contention. But what's really interesting is when you get into their statistics and the expectation that we normally would, have that those statistics would produce, they're having a really, really interesting season. So let's start out with run differential. So they're a plus 77 run differential. To put that in perspective, there's only one team in the American League better than that, and that's the New York Yankees. Okay. But this is where I just find this really, it's just an incredible. So baseball is ruled by statistics and has been forever. And over the course of a 162-game season, those statistics, they don't lie, right? It's not a small sample size. This isn't the NFL where there's a really small number of games. There's a ton of games that are played. And yeah, weeks happen, months happen, but over the course of the season, statistics always play themselves out, right? Very, very standard in baseball. As the season stands right now, the Detroit Tigers' expected win-loss is 73-56. They are 12 games worse than their expected wins-loss, which it just never happens in baseball. It is extremely unusual that a team would have that kind of, I'm going to use the word luck, although I don't really think it's luck. We're going to talk about in a moment why that is. But certainly on the surface, if you see a team with a plus 77 run differential at this point in the season, for them to be 7 games below 500 on the surface, you would think they got to be the unluckiest team that's ever played a season in baseball. And I'm sure there is a little bit of that. But again, luck tends to work itself out over a 162-game season. So it's really, nothing's ever this simple, but I'm going to really, really simplify what the problem is for the Detroit Tigers. It's the back end of the bullpen. They lead all of baseball. They've blown 28 games this year, blown saves at the end of seasons, and they've only converted 25 of 54 save opportunities. So to put that in perspective, if they just convert half of those blown saves, they're at 75 wins right now and easily in the playoffs. So even with a large margin of error from a perspective of the amount of saves they could have blown, they would be well into the playoffs in the American League. They've blown so many saves at the back end of their bullpen. They're a below 500 team, and quite frankly, on the surface, win-loss record not very competitive. Kenley Jansen, Finnegan, they've just not been very good at the back of the bullpen. They've lost a lot of close games, but more importantly, I mean, again, they've had 54 chances to save a game, and they've converted 25 of them. And then to make matters worse for the Detroit Tigers, their next 3 series are Tampa, the Dodgers, and the Twins. So they've got 3 really tough series coming up. It's getting late in the year. Now, their schedule definitely gets more favorable after that, for sure. But it's really incredible to me that when you think about a Tigers team that traded Tarek Skubal, like just this one thing tells you, hey, the priority for the Tigers at the trade deadline really needed to be a closer. I mean, you could go through every number you wanted to for the Tigers, but I'll go back to if you just convert half of the blown saves, you're easily in the playoffs, very comfortably getting ready for October. And so this seems to have been a theme this week for me around people that run professional sports teams and make decisions at times seem to be the one group of people who don't recognize what everyone else does. And I know that's a little bit broad, but certainly some of my teams that I follow, I look at them and say, hey, how is it that everyone that's involved at all can clearly see what the problem is, except for the one person who gets to make that decision apparently just didn't think it was a big enough issue to do something about. And if you think about the Detroit Tigers this year, just knowing that one thing, just knowing that one statistic with their expected win-loss, to go into the trade deadline and not find a way, and by the way, again, a team that was going to trade Tarek Skubal could not find a way to get a really strong back into the bullpen arm to help with that situation, it makes you scratch your head a little bit. So the Tigers are having a statistically historical anomaly from what they're playing on the field and what that's producing in wins, losses. And you can tie a vast majority of that back to the bullpen and the back end of the bullpen not being able to close out games. It's really, really hurt the Detroit Tigers. And quite frankly, on the surface right now, I can't see a way they get into the playoffs. And so it's tough to look back at a season where you say, hey, again, overall, the team looks like they played really, really well. But at the end of the day, you're sitting at home in October watching on TV because you couldn't figure out the closer situation at the back of your bullpen, which appears to be exactly where the Tigers sit today. So maybe keeping on this topic of people that are running teams who seem to ignore the obvious things in front of them, want to take a minute to talk about my Atlanta Braves and the question I asked at the beginning of, are they becoming who we were afraid that they were? I think the answer currently is yes. Another example of a team that went into the trade deadline where I think the fans, the media, pundits, experts, whatever you want to say, all agreed with what Atlanta needed to do leading up to the trade deadline. Unfortunately, as we've talked about on previous episodes, the one person, Alex Anthopoulos, who got to make those decisions at the end of the day, it sounds like he tried to make a trade for a couple of guys that didn't work out. But then, feels that, hey, but this team's good enough to win. Over the last couple of weeks, what we've seen is this team is clearly not good enough to win. And I'm now beginning to question, can they even get into the playoffs if this continues? So last 15 games, they're 5-10. If you have watched them the way I have, quite frankly, they're lucky to be 5-10. They've been outscored 64-47, and the offense is extremely anemic. It almost doesn't exist. In those 15 games, they're hitting .211 as a team. They've been shut out twice. They've scored 1 run 3 times. And if you watch them, they can't get on base. They cannot hit with people in scoring position. Their walk rate is atrocious. It's really disturbing to watch. And I think, ironically enough, we talked a lot about pitching going into the trade deadline. Their pitching's been excellent. They've allowed 4 runs or fewer in 11 of those 15 games. So you think about that, 11 of those 15 games, 4 runs or less, and you're 5-10. Chris Sale, just again the other day, pitches an absolute gem. They can't win because they can't score. And I think the other thing too that's probably to note is here over the last 15 games, they've played some good teams, playoff caliber teams. And I think unfortunately, I think for all of us as fans and watching, what it's clearly showing you is this team is not good enough to win in October. I might even take it a step further and tell you this team isn't going to win in October if they get there. Yankees, yes, the Mets aren't good. Diamondbacks, Twins, White Sox, Brewers. Twins playing well. White Sox and Brewers going to be in the playoffs. Yankees probably in the playoffs. Atlanta can't score. So when you think about them as a team, Ozzie Albies, Ronald Acuna, Drake Baldwin, and these guys have lost at the plate. And, Albies has been a little bit of an experiment over the last 2 or 3 years. But, Ronald Acuna is a former MVP. Drake Baldwin was the best catcher in baseball the first couple of months of the season. I think Austin Riley struggles, although he's been much better in the second half. But I think that it's time for us to start asking the question, right? Like Tim Hires, the coaching staff. They have a lot of proven offensive players on that team, and honestly, outside of Matt Olson, on their very best day, they're highly inconsistent, and then most days they're underperforming. I don't think what Tim Hires did last year with them offensively worked. I don't think it's working this year. And I think at some point, the Braves got to make a decision on, do they need to get a different voice? Because offensively they continue to struggle. Ozzie Albies has been so bad the last 2 years. Now you begin to question, should they even pick up his option next year, even though it's extremely team friendly? I watched Ronald Acuna, and I just don't know what happened to one of my favorite players and one of the most electric players in the game. He looks lost at the plate. Again, Baldwin, same thing over the last, call it 3-4 weeks. He just looks lost. And, this team this year, more so than probably any Braves team I can ever remember, I don't know how many pitches they miss right down the middle. They seem to be behind on fastballs. They don't recognize pitches well. And all of that translates into they're not scoring well. And, that team that was so good the first 2 months of the season, the best team in baseball, and then you look at them now, unfortunately, I think what they are now is much closer to reality than what they were the first 2 months of the season. And a lot's going to have to change with that team if they're going to, number one, get into October, which it would take quite the collapse for them not to get in, at least as a wild card. But you keep going 5-10, and that happens real quick. So, again, hopefully that the offense can wake up, but really, really tough stretch for the Braves again. And pitching been excellent, not a pitching issue, at least currently, but certainly offensively something needs to be done different there. So something we'll certainly continue to monitor as we get late in the season here. All right, let's get into Around the Diamond. Let's talk about who's been hot over the last week. So Jordan Walker of the Cardinals has been absolutely on fire. 412 average, 4 homers, scored 9 runs, driven in 12, slugging .882 for the Cardinals. So he's had a really good season. He's had a few ups and downs throughout the year as far as just consistency, but certainly was one of their top prospects, and looks like he is certainly going to have a really nice career and a really fun player to watch, and certainly had some streaks this year at times where he's really, really been on fire, and had another one this past week, which is always good to see. And then who's cold this week? Jackson Merrill, the Padres. Really rough week, 182, slugged 318 and 24 plate appearances. Padres team that, again, is fighting with a lot of teams to get into the playoffs. Certainly Jackson Merrill would be a big help when he's playing well, and so they're going to need him to certainly pick it up here the last month of the season as we get really, really late in the year here. All right, so that takes us to turning back the clock. So very interesting this week. So something very tragic that happened in baseball changed the game really forever. And when I think about how this particular part of the game plays out today, it's crazy to think about how much it's changed over the years. But our turning back the clock today takes us back to August 16th of 1920. Cleveland Indians and New York Yankees at the Polo Grounds. In the 5th inning, Ray Chapman was up to bat against Yankee pitcher Carl Mays. Ironically enough, a note says that Carl Mays was an unpopular pitcher known for his aggressive underhand submarine delivery. And this is where this is interesting how much the way the game was played back then. So back then, baseballs were rarely replaced during games. Pitchers routinely smeared the ball with dirt, tobacco juice, licorice, saliva to make it dark, misshapen, and really unpredictable on the way to the plate. Now, stark contrast to the day where I swear they throw a new baseball out there every single pitch. I think it's gotten a little ridiculous. I mean, if a ball even touches anything, they're getting a new baseball. But back then, might play with the whole ball, ball as long as they possibly could until it was hit out of play. So, taking all that into account, as they kind of got into late afternoon, early evening, he threw a fastball that drifted inside him because the ball was heavily dirty and discolored. Most people think that Chapman never saw it, but he stood frozen in the box and the ball struck him in the skull. The impact was so loud that the pitcher actually thought he hit the ball and fielded it and threw it to first base. Chapman collapsed, bleeding from his ear, and died at a New York hospital 12 hours later. Interestingly enough, it is the only fatality ever attributed to a Major League Baseball game. And so, as tragic as that was, it really changed the game forever. So, after that kind of happened, Major League Baseball executives had already started debating a partial ban on trick pitches before this ever happened, but his death forced them to make some immediate and permanent changes to the game that still live on today. So the very first one was what they called the clean ball rule. So umpires were strictly ordered to replace baseballs the moment it became dirty or scuffed. Again, I feel like in today's world, they've gone a little too far with that. But that's where they stopped allowing pitchers to use balls as long as they could and get them dirty and stuff and have stuff on them. They completely banned the spitball at that point. Ahead of the 21 season, they banned it in any other doctoring technique. So what we think about today is certainly in the cheating realm, but back then, getting rid of the use of anything like Vaseline, emery papers, anything that could scuff a baseball up. And then, ironically enough, there was a grandfather clause. Many pitchers relied on the spitball for their livelihood, so at the time, MLB permitted 17 existing spitball pitchers to continue throwing the pitch until they retired, but for everyone else in baseball, it was completely outlawed. And the last legal spitballer, as they aged that over the years, was thrown by Hall of Fame pitcher Burley Grimes, known as Old Stubblebeard. He chewed slippery elm bark to generate extra saliva. He retired after the 1934 season, officially making the spitball extinct in the major leagues. So a story that really started out with tragedy, but really changed the game of baseball forever. Certainly, even today, has very large impacts when you think about how, even a few years ago they changed where they're constantly checking pitchers' gloves and hands for any type of sticky substance. And I think for me, I always thought about that more through the lens of like being fair to hitters, right? Like a competitive thing. But it was actually all started because someone got hit and killed in the major leagues with a pitch that most people believe he probably never even saw due to the discoloration of the baseball and whatever the pitcher was doing to kind of doctor it up. So interesting that, as we sit here today, and again, we're a game where there's a new ball all the time, the pitchers are constantly being checked for any type of substance. Certainly cheating comes with some very, very, I would just say extreme suspensions and things like that. You can date a lot of that back to the 1920s when, unfortunately, Ray Chapman lost his life, but it changed the way that pitchers were able to use the baseball forever going forward. So, interesting story this week on Turning Back the Clock, and really enjoyed doing this segment. I've learned a lot of stuff about just some historical things I didn't know or didn't understand the context or maybe didn't understand the whole story. And this is another one where, again, I always assumed that the rule of them not being able to doctor the baseball came from being, trying to give everyone a fair advantage at the plate. But the reality is that it actually stemmed from someone losing their life over a pitch they potentially never even saw. So another interesting story this episode on Turning Back the Clock. All right, well, that's going to wrap up this episode. If you guys want to hear more about the Brewers, wrote a blog, winningseasonsg.com. You can check out the full blog there that's got some more statistical analysis and kind of look back over the last 5 years and how the Brewers have performed. Also encourage you to go to the website. There's other blog posts on there that I'm writing, as well as you can find all the episodes here. And then certainly YouTube and X. You can find me at Winning Season SG. And obviously wherever you get your podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcast as well. Appreciate you guys listening. If you haven't signed up and subscribed, feel free to do so. On the website, you can also sign up for my newsletter where you'll get any blog posts that are written, emailed directly to you. And appreciate you guys all listening. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends, and look forward to seeing you all next time on the Winning Season with Seth G.